share my.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I am Scott Mathias from NCAA, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. Just a few housekeeping notes as people are joining. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A or chat windows. We will be monitoring the questions and we'll try to answer them all in the allotted time. Within 24 hours of today's webinar, I will email everyone a link to the recording, as well as an online survey. Once you fill out the survey, a certificate of completion for the webinar will be emailed to you. Today's webinar, Making the Grade Standards-Based, Traditional, or Both, is being led by Kendell Hunter and Polly Thomas, both from Otus. Before I turn it over to our presenters, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God, help us to know who we are. Let us see ourselves as you see us. As you gaze upon us, show us that you love us in our strengths and weaknesses. Open our hearts so we can hear you call us beloved daughter or beloved son. Then, secure in our identities, let us act that others see you through us. Rid us of the need to draw attention to ourselves. May we always point to you. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Kendell and Polly, thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome. My name is Polly Thomas, and I am the National Catholic Schools Sales Manager for Otus. I'm very excited to be sharing with you Making the Grade Standards-Based, Traditional, or Both. And I'm going to kick things over to Kendell.
All right. Well, hi there, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday so far. I'm excited to be here with Polly today for my first NCAA webinar. My name's Kendell Hunter. I'm a product marketing manager at Otus, but my background's actually not in marketing at all. I'm a former middle school special education teacher. I taught in the Chicagoland area for about 7 years. I also spent some time teaching high school English in Beijing, China. So I really try to bring those diverse experiences to my work now with schools and Catholic schools really across the country. I'm also the product of a Catholic school education, K-12, which is, I look back on extremely fondly. So I'm happy to be with you all here today as part of the NCAA and Otus partnership. As Scott mentioned, we are talking about making the grade. So we are really going to explore standards-based grading and discuss some of the research, but more so what we're seeing with Catholic school educators across the country. But we know that research is showing that through standards-based grading, you can really accelerate students' mastery of the skills that they're working on. And as school leaders are starting to implement standards-based grading, what we're really seeing is that a shift in practice has its challenges. So we're just here transparently today to have a great discussion and dialogue around standards-based grading, the value that we see in that, a little bit more about the tool Otus that allows educators to focus on standards-based grading, but we'll discuss all areas of an implementation and transition to a new grading policy, from communication with educators to communication with all stakeholders, including students and families, because that's a really huge part of any grading policy. So yeah, we're excited to have this discussion with you all today. I know Polly has a little Otus commercial before we jump into some questions that we'll discuss. We're really gonna just engage in dialogue today. So we have some common questions that we see come up around standards-based grading that we're gonna discuss during today's webinar in a really conversational format. I do see lots of folks logged on, which is great. So feel free to chat with us while we're talking, if you can relate to any of the items that we're running through. So yeah, I'm excited to be here with you today, and I'll hand it off to Polly.
Thank you very much, Kendell. So Otus is one integrated platform that saves educators time by keeping everything in one place. And it allows educators, students, and families to visualize student growth in a couple of different ways. And it allows students to, or I'm sorry, it allows educators to assess students. It It allows teachers to grade. We have a standards-based and traditional grade book, which is what we're going to talk about today. We also have a progress monitoring tool and the ability to pull all of that data together so that teachers can make data-driven decisions. And as I work with Catholic schools across the nation, Kendall, I know that grading and assessment can be a very hot topic for teachers, administrators, and parents. So I thought maybe we could start off with you explaining the different grading styles that teachers and schools utilize.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I've been working with schools in my role at Otus for around 4 years now, really with schools across the country. And I would say, all in all, there's really 3 main types of grading systems that we see schools utilizing. So I can kind of walk you through what those look like and just mention along the way some of the value that we see for each one. So the first grading style or grading scale that we see some educators and schools utilizing is just a traditional points-based grading system. And I like to start with that when I think about grading because that's what I experienced growing up. That's when I was studying to be a teacher. That's how grading was done. So I was new to standards-based grading while I was in the field teaching students. But traditional points is definitely still alive in K-12 classrooms. And that's where a lot of educators are at, but looking to move towards standards-based grading. And when they're looking to move towards standards-based grading, they often adopt the second most common model that I see, which is a hybrid of both. And really why I see schools adopting a hybrid grading system is because they want to communicate an overall score, like 80% in math, which might be something that, you're familiar with, or if you have children who are points-based grading, or think back to your grades when you were in the classroom, you earned an A, a B, a C, a D, and that aligned to some points-based value. So when we think of a hybrid, it's providing students that traditional points-based grade, but also assessing standards and really holistically looking at how a student is progressing towards a skill. So I'm a former reading specialist, so I always like to pull in an ELA example. Let's say that you're working on citing text evidence. It's really important for students to be able to find in the text where they found their answer, how they know, right, to back up their claim with evidence. So if we take that citing text evidence, in a traditional grading system, we might see a student earn an 85% on one test of that skill or one assessment of that skill. But in a standards-based grading system, we can take that skill and see all of the corresponding assessments along the way that led to where the student is really at, which becomes that growth journey that Polly referenced as part of the Otus suite of tools, being able to follow a student's journey to mastery or where you want them to be meeting expectations. And that's really why hybrid grading scales are so popular in K-12 school systems. It's because that communication of the points-based grade is what has been done, what we're comfortable with, what the community knows, what's easy to relay and not have as many questions around. But that holistic view of standards performance allows us to dig in a little bit deeper. And with standards-based grading in Otus, you can really follow through interactive visuals every student's journey towards where you want them to be and then adapt. So if half your class is not yet meeting standards, that's an indicator to you, hey, maybe I need to go back, reset the table for those kiddos, and then move the other portion of my class who is meeting expectations forward. So it's not that 85% or a B or an A, there's anything wrong with communicating through that. There's like lots of schools utilizing that points-based system that I referenced, but it's that hybrid system that we see more schools moving towards, so they have a little bit of both. And I did reference that there's 3 systems we see because we do see some schools all in on standards-based grading. I will say the schools who I see all in on standards-based grading, meaning fully adopting a standards-based grading mentality or standards referenced grading mentality, they are really just communicating the standard scores with all stakeholders. I will say to get there, I think a lot of schools adopt a hybrid model first. It's just a natural progression to slowly move from, one end of the spectrum to the other. And we'll kind of dig into this more throughout, but that community buy-in and helping families and students really understand what the grades mean is just so huge. So that's why I think starting with points, moving to hybrid, and then all the way over to standards. If that's your end goal, it might not be for your community and it might not be appropriate, but if it is, we kind of see that scaffolded approach of moving students towards that. And with Otus, some of the visuals that you can encounter or utilize as part of either points or standards are super interactive. So everyone can really dig in and see where a student is at. But that standards-based journey just totally paints a different picture of what the last 6, 12, weeks of instruction looked like.
I bet you that's just so important, especially like you mentioned, all the stakeholders. So the families, even the students, I imagine being able to see their growth journey is extremely important.
Absolutely. And I would say, I see a really relevant question in the chat that I just want to touch on, because especially when we think about how different schools and systems communicate grading performance. Thank you so much for this question. The question is, what if we have some doing standards-based grading and some using points? And the reality is that that's actually how I see most schools across the country setting up their grading systems, because what works for one grade might not work for the other grade. And maybe we could band grades together a little bit better. So like what works at early elementary, K3, might be standards because we're looking at those skills, those early reading skills. Whereas at the 6th through 8th grade level, we may be more comfortable communicating hybrid of both or points. And if you're in the process of evaluating a system to support standards-based grading, I highly, highly, highly recommend finding a system that is flexible, because there's truly, this is education. We're not one size fits all, right? What works for one group of students isn't going to work for the next. So you have to have a platform that allows for a little bit of both and customizable, because no grade is ever going to need exactly the same thing. Certainly it's helpful to have consistency and, have a plan for what that looks like if it is different. We see lots of schools using different combinations of points and standards depending on the students that are in that grade level. So that's a really good question. Sorry, Polly, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but I like.
No, that was very relevant. I'm glad that you grabbed that out of the chat. So how do the different grading scales communicate student performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about whether it's points, hybrid, or all-in standards-based grading, I think as educators, we just simply have to ask ourselves how clear the scale is to us, and then that will be what we communicate to those outside of us. So I'll just be fully honest. When I was a teacher, my school adopted standards-based grading. And as I mentioned, I was not taught about standards-based grading in my, pre-teacher coursework. It was completely new to me, but my school went through a 3-year adoption. So we spent 3 years providing professional development to teachers around standards-based grading. And it was during that experience that I started to kind of shift my own mentality with ongoing access to education on the topics, where I started to wonder, as I was creating assessments in my grade book out of 10 points or 20 points, I would ask myself, like, what is the difference between 10 or 20 points? What does it matter if question 1 is worth 3 points and question 2 is worth 5 points? And why am I the one who gets to decide that? So when I think about this question here, I think oftentimes it goes back to, like, do we fully understand why certain questions, assignments, everything is worth a different number of points or worth, a different value? Because if I can't explain to you why the last question on the assessment is worth more than the first, there's no way students or family members are going to be able to understand that either. And that's kind of what created for me my buy-in to standards-based grading, because I can really clearly understand a 4-point rubric. There's much less variance between, each level. You can see clearly this is a 1, this is defined as a 1, this is a 2. Whereas if I have like a 90% or a 92%, can I differentiate what that is? Can a student differentiate for me? Like, oh, I got an 89, I'm 1 point away from an A. I remember being that student, and I, in my head, be like, well, I guess I just needed to get like one more question right on that test, and then I would have had an A over a B. Versus a really clearly standards aligned rubric, I might be able to look at the rubric and say, okay, I'm a 3, which means I identified, text evidence that sufficiently supported my claim, but wasn't as strong as it could be. So it's just like changing the conversation to better understand what it is that the grade is communicating, not just to me as a teacher, but to the student. And do we have evidence that aligns to that. So I think that's really important. And when you're looking at standards-based grading in general, I think a really good tool to consider incorporating are rubrics, because rubrics are really clearly aligned to standards and can communicate exactly where a student is at. For example, Otus does have a rubric assessment that allows students to submit a product side by side with the rubric, so everyone can see how that grading scale is communicating performance. So I just think that's a really useful tool. But that being said, you're not going to use a rubric for every assessment. At Otus, we definitely have a number of different ready-to-use assessment types that educators can tap into, many of which have auto scoring. I know rubrics typically involve a little bit more work on the teacher end because you have to evaluate each product. So certainly that's not going to be the assessment that you utilize all the time. And, Otus is a great platform to consider for some of those other assessment types, because there really are a number of different ready-to-use assessments, or you can build your own, of course. So that's definitely something to consider. And the assessments are great for every grade level, every content area. If you are adopting different standards, so perhaps as a Catholic educator, the diocese has different standards than like the Common Core or the state-based standards, you can still assess those on Otus, rubric assessments or other assessments. So there's really a lot of flexibility there.
Great. I'm sorry. I apologize. I lost my my slides, but I'm going to bring them back up.
That's okay. A question came in, actually 2 questions came in. So while you're pulling that up, I can address those. The first one is if you're using your own custom standards, do you have to upload them yourself as an educator? And definitely not with Otus. So with Otus, we have a really exceptional onboarding process. So we work with Catholic educators to identify the standards that they are using and then get those in the system for them. So there's no expectation that anyone is, manually entering standards. Those are all preloaded. We certainly have plenty of preloaded standards in there, your state, Common Core, and GSS standards. But if you perhaps have your own standards within your Catholic school or within the diocese that your school is a part of, those would be something that we would put in there. So educators are all using the same language, which is just so important with standards-based grading. If we're not using the same language, we're not communicating any more clearly, which is really the point of adopting a new system, right, to improve our communication. There's a question here. It says, how does a teacher manage standards-based grading if half the students are on different levels? Example, students are 3rd graders working on kindergarten, 1st graders working on a different level. And this is a really great question because this is the reality, right? Not every student is getting the exact same coursework at all times. I'm a former special education teacher, so half of my class was 6th grade, but they were working at the 1st or 2nd grade level. And at least I can only speak for my experience of how this is managed in Otus for the time we have today. But as far as Otus, how this would work, no student ever has to be assigned the same grade for standards, or the same standards have to be assessed for every student. So if a student isn't working on a standard, you simply don't give them the grade for that standard when you're grading the work. You can choose a group of students to assign work to that's aligned to their standards, and other students in the class won't ever know that they were a part of that. So it's not like giving them a 0, or if you have like level 1 on the scale, you just don't give them a score in Otus. And that ensures that when I log in, I see my work at my standards. When Polly logs in, she sees her work at her standards. So you can absolutely differentiate within the platform. That's what it does very well, because students are never all working on the same level. And there's always, that need to be able to assess students on standards that are relevant to where they're currently at. Now, certainly if everyone in 5th grade is working on a 5th grade standard, great, you're just grading them all at once, but you don't have to do that if that's not appropriate for your population.
Thank you, Kendall. That makes complete sense. And I hope that that question was answered. What meaning do grades carry? Could you define both point-based and standard-based?
Sure. Yeah, so when we think about the meaning that grades carry, there you go, your question is on the screen now. I think mine had a little lag. So when we think about the meaning that grades carry, I think it really just boils down to a student's present level, right? So whether your points, standards, or a little bit of a hybrid of both, the meaning that the grade carries is it should communicate at that time a snapshot of where the child is. Now, it can be, if it's the end of the marking period, it should tell you where they are in relation to where they should be so that you can identify gaps or needs. But in general, a grade should simply communicate the current letter. Now, with traditional grades, your points-based scores might translate over to a letter grade, but then, the question then does become, what does an A mean? How is it different from a B? If an A is a 90 and a B is 89%, is A mean I'm meeting every single standard? Am I exceeding grade level expectations if I'm an A? Am I meeting? Kind of creates that discrepancy, because with that traditional grading, we often don't define A, B, C, D. We're just used to feeling good about an A or a B and maybe feeling okay about a C, but bad about a D or an F, or at least maybe I'm just projecting my own feelings growing up with grades there. But that's really, as we think about standards-based grading, why so many schools are resetting the table and redefining what their grades mean. And honestly, I've seen so many different scales. I see lots of schools doing like a 1, 2, 3, 4 for standards-based grading, where the number doesn't correlate to like 2 out of 4 being 50%. 2 might be approaching, 4 might be meeting or exceeding. Or I see schools using all language-based standards-based grading scales, like not at standard, approaching, meeting, exceeding. No matter what it is, the meaning of that, you get the ability to define. And what we see a lot of schools doing is really building that out so that every teacher can adapt it to the standards they're working on, regardless of their content area. So if a 2 is approaching, it means the student is not yet displaying full exactly what the standard says in its full totality, right? They're a step below what might be exactly what the standard says, but you can come up with that common language. We see lots of schools in their professional learning communities doing just that. And honestly, like, these are long conversations. It's not as easy as just like, okay, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, we're done. It's coming to a common understanding of, this is what a 2 means for our school community, or this is what meets means in our school community. And I think it's so important once you've aligned on that. Certainly you're going to iterate and adapt as you get feedback from the community, but to begin to incorporate that in all of your communication with students and family, right? Like, if I'm a teacher helping my students understand the scale, I'm pulling it up, we're reading through it, like, you're a 2, this is what a 2 looks like, this is where you need to go, this is how you can get to a 3. Something that Otus does really well is we do have the ability for administrators to add custom grading scales right to Otus, so you can build out whatever your scale looks like. And then there's a little description box, so you can define it and include that on printed report cards for families. So when they maybe get a report card that's hybrid, it includes some points and standards, and they say, well, what does this meet? What did you meet? Who did you meet? Maybe they're not sure at all, and they need a little bit more parent education on what that means. You can actually have it included right on the report card with the same language for everyone. So if I have 3 students in the school building, I can see, oh, okay, we're adopting this new system. Like, this is what a 3 means. Now, of course, I would say family education should probably go far beyond what's printed on that, just based on my experience with other schools. Lots of training is needed, lots of conversations, lots of materials. But that being said, it is nice to be able to have that consistent language available in a platform if you're looking to assess students on standards and start to communicate that to the whole population. Because the reality is, if everyone's not aligned on the grading policies, the communication and this exact question can lead to confusion, honestly. If we don't all know what the meaning is, we're not going to think, we're not going to understand it. And then we're not going to really know where kids are. And I would say it starts from the top down, right? If administrators create the scale and then educate teachers on it, if that's like the path for your school, kind of working top down and helping to get everyone's buy-in, or maybe doing a feedback loop if you're not getting buy-in, why that is. Because, we all need to understand the meaning of the grade to properly communicate.
Yes, I agree. And speaking the same language is absolutely key. So what are some common struggles with the different grading styles?
Yeah, this is a good question. I kind of started to allude to this, so perfect timing here. Communication and consistency, and then teacher buy-in is huge. When I first started working at Otus, I would go to school districts for training, and I can't tell you how many times they would, like, the teachers in the room hadn't had the proper background set around standards-based grading. So they would ask me, they're like, well, I don't want to use this language. What are we doing? I'm like, oh, I don't know. We have to talk to your administrator. And then they are frustrated. And most times they're frustrated at me, which, is fine. No big deal. I was not upset about that, but I could feel the stress because they hadn't been communicated with around, where did this come from? Why are we doing this? What does the research show? Or why did we choose this language? There wasn't that element of involvement so that teachers felt comfortable implementing it with students, which, having been a teacher, I would feel the exact same way. It's like getting a top-down, direction that you haven't really been given any background on, and you have questions. So I would say, starting with teachers, being involved in the process, being involved in, having a stake in a say, right, is so important to have your voice be heard. As an administrator, I always suggest feedback loops, and, certainly feedback is what it is. You take parts of it, and you don't always have to take all of it, but involving folks in the process. And then, that communication with the larger community is just so important. Most family members of school age children, so students K-8 or K-12, most of those parents did not grow up with standards-based grading or standards reference grading. This is all very new to them. So looking at your community, I know we have a lot of educators on today, and your community might be different than another participant here today, but looking at your community and the parents that make up that population, or any family members in the population, and really honestly addressing the gap between what families experience growing up and perhaps what they're being informed about through their child's education in your Catholic school, is just so important, and is a reality that with any grading system we have to begin to tackle. Is that, there is a gap oftentimes between what we're saying and what a family is hearing or understanding, not even, apart from having a different native language, just simply with the academic language that we're presenting. So I would say, be consistent. If you start something for the school year and you communicate that out, certainly, it's possible you're going to iterate, but be consistent and communicate as changes happen so that teachers know, then families know, and kind of work to educate the larger population. Having been working in schools with, students who are already bought into standards-based grading, I would say students actually pick it up pretty quickly when you work to educate them, and can often help you educate their family members. I've seen students give like their own explanation of, well, I'm a 3 because I missed this piece of evidence and it said I needed to identify 3, but I identified 2 pieces of evidence. So, engaging in that dialogue around what you see, what you're doing, and what it means at the student level, at the family level, and of course with teachers too, I think are, those are some struggles, but some suggestions as well.
Great. So I know that you answered some of this, but how can schools support families in understanding standards-based grading?
Yeah, so I would say, before the school year starts, plan, over communicate, right? Maybe there's a parent letter, send it multiple times, right? At every conference, have teachers explain what they're doing. At every back to school night, start it over. Maybe you launched standards-based grading to a small extent last year and you're doing it again. Assume that nobody knows, and assume that they think you're doing it the way you were doing it before, and just kind of keep going, keep planning, keep communicating, perhaps provide some literature. I have seen schools launch on their website a separate page for their grading system. Hey, we're still doing this points-based grading. You'll still see 70% A, B, C, D, but now you're going to see these standards. Here's a video from somebody in education who's breaking this down and helping you understand why we're doing this, because it is nice to have a third party stand behind you. There's lots of research out there that you can pull from as to why you might want to make the shift. Find somebody in the thought leadership realm who aligns with what you're doing, and maybe offer that to families. Not everyone will watch it, that's the reality, but there's probably some who really will, and they'll say like, okay, this makes sense. I understand why we're doing this. It is to maximize student outcomes, or it is to better understand where we are where we want to go and, facilitate the growth of the whole child, like family members will start to buy in once you provide them with that, relationship where you are helping them understand why you're doing what they're doing, and it's for their children. I would also say, at least in my experience with Otus, we provide family training. So, if schools are using our gradebook and they want somebody to be there to help family members who just have questions or needs, we'll be like on Zoom, or we've had colleagues go in person to, back to school night, and they're just there to ask questions like, oh, you're not as tech savvy, and do you need me to help you pull this website up? Like, it's not that you need to be tech savvy, but if you need help finding the website or figuring out what to do, just making that support accessible, because we don't, just like with grading technology, we don't all come in at the same level and have the same experiences. There might be some family members who don't have a desktop at home or a computer, and they want to know how to get on their phone, and they might need a little extra support. So, don't sleep on providing extra training so that everyone feels comfortable. Not everybody may tap into it, but just having the option there is really important. And also utilizing a platform that has an easy to use interface, really easy to navigate, really digestible visuals. I would say that is also important, because you want family members to be able to see visuals that help them understand where children are, and those should be really easy to follow. If you do have multiple children in your district or at your Catholic school, what's great about Otus is you can have one account for all of your kiddos. So if you have 4 children, you can have one Otus account and easily just click between each of those kids to see their data and follow their journey and engage in that dialogue. And the visuals don't change based on the child. So they're the same. There's a lot of consistency. And if you're evaluating a platform for grading, for standards-based grading, I would say definitely look for something like that, because you don't want to have 5 or 6 different logins for every child. That's just crazy, cumbersome, and honestly, you'll probably lose one of those logins, and we don't want our students to not be able to, have you engage in dialogue with them around what's meaningful and what's happening in school.
Yes, I 1000% agree. I only had 2 children, and I had a lot of logins and passwords, and it was inevitable that I got locked out of something. So, so how do grading policy styles tie to student motivation?
This is a great question. And this is actually one of the big barriers that we see coming up when people are hesitant to start to adopt standards-based grading. There's lots of, schools of thought, or people kind of get hung up on the idea that, well, if I can't give them an F, they're probably not going to do, the work anymore. Like, what does it matter if we're giving them a standards-based grade? I need to be able to give them a 0 so that they see that 0, so that it impacts their score, and so that they can feel that to really get them to turn in the work and be motivated. But the reality that I've seen in my work with schools who are using standards-based grading is that students who struggle with motivation are going to struggle if it's an 80%, a 70%, a 60%, a traditional points-based grade, or if it's no evidence or a 1 out of 4 on the scale. It's not necessarily any more motivating if I have an F versus if I have a 1, right? What we can control is how we motivate the unmotivated, because engaging students in their academics is going to be more of a way to build up their motivation rather than just penalizing them for their grades. So if we're constantly working to create engaging and relevant content, building relationships, I personally believe that the rest will follow. Because just from what I've seen, if you're struggling with motivation, the F, I mean, I don't know how many times you've given an F and then the next grade's an A right after that, but that didn't seem to work for me when I was a teacher. And it didn't really work for my colleagues either, because we sat in many a problem solving meeting for hours looking at 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So we have to do something else. And what we can do is, create relevant, meaningful content, give students choices and a voice in their learning. All of those things can help to change the trajectory of a student who is perhaps unmotivated. I will say though, if you are feeling that you need to assess or provide feedback on something like motivation, or maybe we're going to call it engaged in learning or work completion, because I know work completion is mainly the reason I had my middle school students getting their 0s in other classes. If you want to provide feedback on that, you can actually do that right in Otus without interfering with the student's academic performance, because we've all had those students who can get 100% on the test and never turn in a homework assignment. So what that means from a standards-based grading lens, or what it could mean, is that you assess the academic skill and you provide feedback on that, and whatever they demonstrated on that summative or formative assessment is tied to that academic skill. But then perhaps we provide feedback on work completion or motivation in class or engaged in learning, and maybe they're at the lowest level there. So then when we're in that conference with that parent, or when we're talking to that student, we say, look at this skill, this academic skill, but look at this life skill, or this, citizenship skill, some 21st century skills, right? We have to show up to work. We have to do our job. Like, there's a gap here. Why aren't we doing this? Let's talk about that, rather than just saying, oh, you have a C in the class because you got 100% on the test, but you did no homework. And maybe for the child, the C's good enough, right? They're like, oh, I don't really want to do the homework. So what's really great about Otus is you can create rubrics. We have lots of schools do this, aligned to student skills, and they provide feedback on that separate from academics, but they still have a conversation around it. So I think that's really a great way to address the motivation concerns. We have lots of schools do that like 2 or 3 times a year, not as much as they might for the academic skills, but just to be able to have that total picture of student performance. Because with a tool like Otus, you have some pretty robust analytics capabilities. You can easily see who are all of my students who earned, the lowest level of this scale on work completion. Maybe we need to put them in a check-in or check-out with their preferred teacher so that we can make sure they're bringing home their notebook, or they're, packing a backpack. Like, are they just leaving the building without their backpack every day and going home and saying no homework? Like, we can really hone in on the skill that they need support with, rather than just having a broad picture of they're just somewhere in the middle at average. So I definitely recommend considering that, and having a platform that allows you to do that is key, because it should not be harder to provide different types of feedback. It should be easier. All grading is feedback. We want to provide as much feedback as we can to the child, the family, so that they really understand strengths and areas of opportunity.
Great. So we've talked a lot about grading and the rationale for grading practices, and looking more specifically at Otus. Do you have the ability to load religious standards into the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our Catholic schools choose to do this. So if you have your own Catholic school standards that you want to be able to assess students on as a product of their education in your school, those can be uploaded by our team. They'll be in the platform for you all. And what's great is the process is the same as your academic standards. So whether you're assessing a religious standard, or you're assessing, maybe a priority English standard that you're working on in a reading class, the process is the same. And students can be at various levels of their religious standards as they can for any of those, English, science, social studies standards. So in Otus, all standards carry equal weight and can be visualized, interacted with. You can analyze them. So there's lots of different capabilities, but absolutely. And I know I mentioned before, Otus has a really great implementation team. I was on that team. We're all former educators, and the team handles the uploads for you. So if I'm assuming if you have religious standards in your school, you have them organized and you can provide them to us and we'll put them in there for you. So there's no lift on, the administrators. And that's just part of using a platform like Otus, is that we are kind of your tour guide, I guess, or your partner, to make sure that everything is set up so that when you go in to assess your religious standards, they're there for you.
Great. And tying things back actually into our sponsorship or with NCEA, many schools also administer the ACRES, and it's now known as the NCEA RISE assessment. Is this something that educators can visualize in Otus?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, because we really didn't talk too much about like data and how Otus integrates with other assessments. But absolutely, one of the strengths of Otus is that in addition to standards-based grading, we allow for data-driven instruction and have really robust analytics. So educators, students, and family, if you'd like, in your community, and administrators can analyze data from any outside assessment. So Catholic school teachers can really see a holistic picture of student performance on those formative and summative measures like we talked about today. but also on their knowledge of religion as measured by acres. So absolutely, you can visualize that. You can even visualize it side by side with their performance on maybe your Catholic school religion standards that you have loaded in Otus. You can kind of see side by side where gaps are. One of the huge strengths of Otus is just the ability to interact with different types of data, no matter what the source. So you're certainly not limited in any capacity there, and our team would work with you to visualize acres in Otus, absolutely.
Amazing. What I'd like to do now at this point is if there's items in the chat that maybe you haven't addressed, we can do that, or if you've already addressed them, and we're going to save time at the very end for Q&A. I'd like to actually pop into our demo site and show what our standards-based gradebook looks like. What do you think, Kendall?
Great question. So we've covered just about all the questions in the chat. So if you want to poke around, and then while you're doing that, maybe we can tee up some more questions, and then we can answer those at the end. Does that sound okay?
Great. Can you see my demo site?
Not yet. We're
Okay.
just looking at the slides.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing real quickly.
No worries. It's always a Zoom toolbar, a mad dash to find the right screen if you're extra screen heavy.
Yes, I have. I was talking about this yesterday. I got new monitors, and every time that happens, it messes me up a little bit. So, and I thought I practiced enough yesterday. Apparently not. All right. So, can you see my demo site now?
We sure can.
Okay, great. So I'm actually logged in as a teacher, and on the left-hand side, I can click into my gradebook. And as you were talking, Kendall, there may be schools that use both points-based and standards-based grading. And so when I log in, I can take a look at my points-based gradebook. But what I'd really like to focus on today is our standards-based gradebook. And one of the things that Kendall mentioned was having the ability to have customizable standards. So Catholic standards, NGSS, religious standards, that sort of thing. And a couple of things when I look at the gradebook. I can see the standard. I can hover over it. It gives me more detail. I can also see down below how my students are performing as a class for each standard that has been assessed. And I also can take a look at this number right here means that Earl has been assessed 4 times on this particular standard. And if I want to see what you were talking about, the progression or the growth journey, I can actually click in and I can see how Earl has performed over time. And if I scroll below, I can also see what assessments Earl had been given and the dates they were taking and how Earl performed. I can also click into a particular tile, and if it was an assessment that was administered within Otus, I can see the assessment and how Earl answered the questions. Wow. My pointer's being a little crazy. And you also talked about the different grading scales, and we have the ability to have different grading scales. We also have the ability to take a look at the different settings. So whether it's decaying average or mean mode, most recent, we do have the ability to adjust that as well. And if you wanted to take a look at a particular standard and see how your students are performing as a class, you also have the ability to do that and take a look at, whoops, that was not the right one. sorry, here we go. You have the ability to see how students are performing as a class on a particular standard. So let's say that I recently taught a particular standard. I gave an assessment and I wanted to see how my class as a whole has performed. I can take a look at that as well without actually going into the grade book. I can also see my students. And if I decide that I need to, for example, like the question was about what if some of my students are at 5th grade level, or what if some of my students are at 3rd grade level? And I do have the ability to create groups from here and add them to a group and maybe do some individual work or some group work with them, and then have the ability to reassess within Otus. One of the other things that Kendall mentioned was the student profile, and having the ability to see the student as a whole. So I can see their points grade book. I also have the ability to see their standards grade book and how they have performed over time, if I click into it. I also have the ability to actually look at the different classes a student is in. And one of the other things that we talked about was the ACRES assessment and having the ability to take a look at that as well. And that's where this would come in. So if you have an assessment such as ACRES or ACT, you would have the ability to take a look at that in a student profile as well.
Holly, we have a couple questions coming in. Do you mind if we tackle them while you're demoing here?
Yeah.
So the first one is a question just around better digging into hybrid grading, which I know we talked a lot about in the earlier part of this webinar. Do you want me to kind of explain how that works in Otus, or do you want to tackle that?
Sure, that would be great.
Yeah, so Polly's in the grade book here. And Polly, actually, if you wouldn't mind just clicking on the word points there on the left-hand side to go into the points grade book. So this is really the beauty of hybrid grading in Otus. If your school is using hybrid grading, you can continue to administer assessments using a traditional points-based grading scale. And you'll kind of see at the top, this gradebook probably looks like one you're using now, right? We've got the name of the assessment, whether it be formative, summative. There is options to have things count and not count, but you can see those are the individual tasks that students are completing, as well as an associated point value. But the beauty of Otus is that all you have to do is align your points assessment to a standard. So tell Otus which standard or standards this assessment is aligned to, and the system moves the scores between points and standards automatically through, without getting technical, we call it like term conversion. It's just an administrator at your school tells Otus when a student earns a 70% on this, that it equates to this level of our standards-based grading scale. And that's all customizable. Everyone defines what that looks like. But hybrid grading is where the grades move from points to standards by you simply giving an assessment aligned to standards. And Otus has standards aligned assessments ready to go. We've got thousands of them, so you don't have to build them. You could if you want to, but we also have ready to use ones. So if you're looking to get started with that, there is a low of no lift because they're already built. So you can kind of see an individual student here, their total grade, their assessments. But Polly, if you click on standards for me, this is really where hybrid comes into play, because for every single standard that we've been assessed on during the unit of instruction or aligned to those standards, they each appear in this grade book here in a column with the name of the standard at the top, not the assessment, the standard, because that's the skill that we're working on, and then all of the corresponding assessments. And what I love, you can actually see for this RL 6.2, it says that Earl here is a meets after 9 attempts. But if you go below, you'll see that Eldon is 6 attempts. So no two students have to have the same number of attempts on standards. But what that tells me is that they've been assessed 6 different times on that particular standard. And after those 6 attempts, they're at meets or not at standards. So that's really like hybrid grading in play, is I can still pull up the assessment, see that I got a 70%, communicate that to students, communicate that to families. But if that assessment that I got a 70% on assessed 3 different skills, and maybe in addition to that one assessment, we've been working on it over time, we can track that journey. So if you wouldn't mind just like clicking on one of those kiddos that has a couple of attempts for me, that would be lovely.
Do you want me to click on the attempts or the kid?
Let's do attempts first, and then we'll do a student, because there was a question about that too. So good catch. So this is really where I can follow that growth journey. 70%, great. That, maybe they're happy with that, maybe they're not. But here's where you as a teacher, an administrator, or a family or student can access the student's journey and kind of see like what was going on back in February that they were not at standard, but then somehow now in March, they were meeting and then they dropped off again. Like, what's going on here? And if we scroll down on the page, we can get more detailed. But at the highest level, I want to point out that in Otus, you can really take advantage of hybrid grading, because if you tell the system what standards you're working on, or if you use one of our assessments aligned to standards, the system is going to do its job and track this data for you. I don't have to grade students on points and then enter a secondary points standards-based score. I don't have to do double the work, which honestly is really quite a benefit, because nobody wants to have to work harder to be able to provide more feedback. It's nice that it will all be consistent and all be done for you. And every student also has an individual standards-based gradebook or points-based gradebook, which is, I think, what Polly was going to pull up for us, so that you can look at a student in every standard that they have been assessed on.
Do you want me to go to the student now?
Let's do the student in the gradebook, if that's okay.
Oh, okay.
So I think you showed the student profile. So Polly's just clicking on a kiddo from the class list, and this opens up the door to all of their standards. So what I love about Otus is it's like each click gives you more. And maybe you just want to see everyone all at once, that really high level, nice overview. That's quick, easy. I can draw my insights right there. But maybe I see something that I'm wondering about and I want to dig into a student. Clicking on them opens up the door for more information and tells me, hey, here's all the standards that they're working on. They have this view and their family member has this view too. And you can see Polly's got some Catholic standards here. That is an excellent way to visualize how they could look in your grade book if you're working on assessing students on specific Catholic standards that are, specific to your diocese. It can appear right in the grade book. She also has some like Common Core ones in there. So that's just a good way to kind of conceptualize that no matter the standard, you always have the same analytics. They can be custom and you can absolutely dig in deeper. There was one question around, Polly, does your gradebook have a total grade for standards where you create a total grade in a standards gradebook? Let's see. Okay, let's do this. Do you mind if I share my gradebook? I have this in mind.
Sure.
Okay, and then we can show a report card as well, since somebody is asking about that.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want me to pull up a report card, or do you have one handy?
I think I should.
Okay.
So I'm just in my teacher gradebook, and my gradebook's just like Polly's gradebook. It's a standards gradebook. Everyone has kind of the same visual and navigation there, which is great. I'm just going to, adjust my screen size here. I hope that's not happening too quickly on your end. Okay. So there was a really great question in the chat around how you are able to see the students' average for standards. So you can see in my gradebook here, I've got my standards that we're working on. And I know earlier there was a great question around differentiating, like what do we do if these kiddos are working on standard 5.2, which is a 5th grade standard, but these students are working on 6th grade standards. You can see Leo here, he doesn't have a score for that because he's not working on that. So really lends itself to differentiation. But you can, this is optional, because as you noticed, I asked Polly to switch screens with me here because she didn't have this in her district. It's not required. it's just an optional setting. But if you want Otus to create a total standards-based grade, much more common for those schools who are all in on standards-based grading, because you need a final grade for maybe a grade level of students who are doing this. But Leo has near mastery in my English language arts class as a result of all the standards Leo has been assessed on. Possibly not the same number of standards as this student Narissa here, who maybe has been assessed on some additional above grade level standards, but you can really easily see their final score. And if I click on a student, you'll see we call that their total grade. So just like in a traditional points-based world, students can have a total grade that reflects an average of things that maybe count or don't count. You can exclude things in Otus just like you can anywhere in any grade book, but you can always pull up a total grade for standards if you want. And again, that's optional. So you decide how the settings look and work in your district based on what's appropriate for your population, the language that you use. It's all customizable. And I do have a report card, so I will pull that up. What's great about Otus report cards is you can print them and distribute them paper-based, but we also have a partnership with Rave mobile reports. So if your community is really tech savvy and you want a mobile or digital distribution, you do have some options there. So I'm just going to pull over some examples to kind of show you what's possible. So this first one is a very, very traditional points-based report card. So you can see the class. Oops, I guess I need to backward zoom. You can see the class. Oopsies, sorry about that. The class, any assessments that you choose to calculate, and overall score and any comments. Pretty standard. You can add your school's logo on it, different options there. Here's an all-in standards-based report card. So I could see the class just like before, but this time I'm just looking at their performance on maybe a few key priority standards. Now, if you were using a report card, or if in your school you had that total grade, that would appear on here. This particular example doesn't have it, but you can see standards, different number for ELA than they're reporting on for social studies. It doesn't have to be the same. You identify what you print out. And then last but not least is a hybrid. So we can still show points and then show each of the individual standards as well as any comments. So there's lots of different options here. These can be printed off at any, by any administrator at any time. You don't have to wait for the end of the quarter or marking period to generate a report card. That's all done right here in Otus. So it's just pulling from the data. There's two other questions in here, and I think we have, Polly, we have about 3 minutes left.
We have about 2 minutes left, so we'll try to get to those.
We will do our best. Christine asked, will a training be offered on this? And I would say we can absolutely provide specific training. So as a part of onboarding with Otus, we work with you to identify your goals and then kind of map out, maybe you have just an hour of time, what makes sense for what you want to learn in that time, and really create a custom training plan for you. So absolutely, training can be provided. We have, lots of different training models. Lots of schools like to do on-site training in person. So working, with us in person or just on Zoom like this is very common as well. So lots of options there. And the other question here, thank you, James. He says, I get grading on standards. What about grading on points versus percentages? Better or worse? Which one and why? So the question here is more around, what would be more favorable, points-based grades like this or providing students a percent? In most cases, I see schools doing both. And I think as far as the better or worse question, it's hard to weigh in on what's better or worse. I would just re-ask the question that we talked about earlier, which is, what does this point or percent communicate? And does the person who we're trying to communicate that to understand what it means to us? So if I earned a 0 out of 8 here, that's probably not a great example. If I earned a 2 out of 8, or if I earned a 25%, right? Those would be the same value. Like, does that tell me something different? Do I better understand where I'm at with the 2 out of 8 than I did with the 25%? Or is there a need for more clarity in general? So all grades should do is communicate where we're at and where we need to go. So I would, whichever one you feel communicates best on student performance is where you should head as a school community, because grades should just help everyone understand where we're at. So a little bit of a tough question to answer. I appreciate it though, for sure. I like a little curveball, so thank you. But I would say for me, yeah, I'm more partial to providing a 4-point grading scale, like a 4-level grading scale, no more than 5 levels grading scale with clear language tied to it, rather than a numerical value, so that there's, that really clear understanding of what each level looks like. Because for me, 25% versus 20%, I don't know, I'm still not there. What does that tell me? So that's my 2 cents, but I think it's important to have a platform that can allow for everyone to find what best communicates progress for them. So definitely check out Otus if that's something that you'd like to do, because that's what we do best.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you both, Holly and Kendall, for this presentation. And I also want to thank our attendees today for the wonderful questions and the interaction with our presenters. If you'd like to see future webinars that NCAA has coming up, you can go to our website, ncea.org/webinars. And there's a list there. You can register right there on the website. I also want to bring your attention to our convention, which is coming up just in a couple of weeks here, April 11th through the 13th in Dallas, Texas. If you want to find out more information about that convention, if you haven't already registered, the address is ncea.org/convention. Thanks again to everyone, and have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.